All right. Well, hello, everybody. Um, this is a long time coming. I welcome you back. We're just starting out these live streams, but we are here. We're going to look at today the 5 ways, or at least a couple of them, 3 in particular. The first 3 ways, Thomas Aquinas. I got to do a little bit of background, laying the background here. So indulge me just a tiny bit to go back through this PowerPoint. Now, I got this PowerPoint, I will admit, I modified it a bit from Rob Coons, who's over at Texas. As you can see here, you can see the dates from Aquinas. We've already gone through a little bit of this. You can look at the last live stream to see what we mean by proving God exists. This isn't moving the goalpost, as somebody had said in the comments in some of these videos. This is not moving the goalpost. This is just getting clear about what we mean by proving God's existence, about our standard for knowledge. You can't have 100% certainty with anything. Why think that then you should have 100? Well, you can have 100% certainty with respect to very few things, that is mathematical truths and logical truths, but you're certainly not going to have 100% certainty with empirical truths, and certainly not with religious truths. So why think that? So this is just getting clear on what we mean, what it is to know, what it means to prove something, what it means to demonstrate something. It's not going to be proving something in the way we can prove a theorem of mathematics, for example. We have to get clear on what we mean. So Aquinas argues that we can know by natural reason that God exists, not just by faith, not on blind faith, not this idea that I just feel a certain way, that I subjectively have it in my heart. You could do that, but I think he offers more. There's much more that you can access through just mere reason. Okay, so let's keep going. If you have fully functioning rational faculties, certainly they can be damaged in some way, but assuming they're not damaged, this knowledge is freely available to anyone. Okay, we went through skepticism last time. And this part about the background, I think this is helpful in the history of philosophy and the history of ideas to really just kind of situate ourselves and get context as to where we are in the history of ideas. So, of course, just a few hundred years ago, we had the Enlightenment era. Here's some notable names like René Descartes, John Locke, and so on. They created or established the so-called myth of the method. That is the method that, well, you can reduce human reasoning just to some sort of computational stuff. That is, you don't really need to use any exercising of judgment or any wisdom, but you can, it's sort of just thought of humans as like these machines almost, although we didn't have computers yet. Although Descartes did discuss thinking, when he was up in his upper room, he imagined that looking down upon people and you can just see their hats. He said, I imagine them being automatons, in other words, like robots. So this was an imaginative thing at the time, although we didn't have the technology for it. But this idea that human reasoning can just be established in these mechanical procedures, a mechanical recipe. I just follow X, Y, and Z, and I will come to know. That was the myth. Of course, that myth is wrong. And so right here, as you see, in the last couple of centuries, it experienced some catastrophic refutations. And so, right, this idea of rationalism, it failed to produce the universal consensus the Enlightenment had promised. And so you get this overreaction. We can't really know things like machines and computers. We can't just know things automatically if we just follow the right recipe. It doesn't work like that, right? But instead of sort of righting the ship, as with anything, the pendulum swings too far and we go overboard, we overreact, and we get to what's called postmodernism, this idea that, if we can't know things using the myth of the method, the mechanical recipe, then I suppose we can't know anything at all. Of course, as you can just think for a moment, that this is an overreaction, right? You can't know anything at all would be the conclusion, because you can't know a few things. That's just overreacting, right? But here we are, we're in postmodernism now, where we deny the very existence of human reason or of a universal truth. This idea of a capital T truth, you can think of it. It's an easy way to think about it. We deny that there are universal truths in postmodernism. It's kind of calling card, as opposed to my truth, our truth. These things, postmodernism is okay with. You can have your truth. That's the way you see things. That's your truth. I have my truth, and so on. This is relativism at its finest. And so the postmodern mind says a little bit like this: they're suspicious of any claim to have or to know universal truth. They tend to see tell me if you've heard this before. They see logic, argumentation, reasoning as a form of coercion or aggression. It seems to be a little hostile if you want to use reason to sort of persuade someone. Tolerance, also in this mindset, becomes the only virtue. Now, the problem with this is that nobody can really live as the postmodernists do. Postmodernists they believe that they do possess the universal truth, although they claim that there is no universal truth. So being inconsistent, they're being self-refuting. They do possess the universal truth, that there is no universal truth. So it's self-defeating, right? And so postmodernists also are inconsistent in this respect, that they are intolerant of those who don't practice this same way of thinking, this postmodern tolerance. So what to do? This is our situation. What do we do? Honestly, you could dismiss postmodernists. You could just not think about them. But I think the idea here is the Christian response, especially the Catholic response, especially, is just to realize postmodernists are wrong about everything, including postmodernism. They're wrong about how the human reason works. They're wrong about how unreliable human reason is. We can know things because all human beings have a natural aptitude for truth. And the human mind is fundamentally rationally structured such that it draws itself to true things. Does it do this perfectly? Of course not. But that's how the human mind was created and designed, and it works in general. Okay, so that's just some background. I just want to kind of lay that as real easy background. I know there's some heavy hitting stuff, but let's now jump into the arguments. Okay, this is what you're all here for. Okay, so look at ways 1, 2, 3 in Thomas Aquinas. Now, there are a couple of different sources on this. You can use newadvent.org. That's one source. I like Fredosso's. Let me put this in the chat. Fredosso's Summa. If you just Google that, you'll find it right away. And in fact, I just learned today he's switching his URL to another host site. He's a emeritus professor at Notre Dame. He's been translating the whole thing. His translation is actually very good. But we find this argument in Aquinas's Summa, and then we find it also in his Summa contra Gentiles, or against the Gentiles, as non-believers. This argument, if we're just thinking about ways 1, 2, 3, which is the focus of today's live stream, this is why I bundled them together. There are 5 ways, sure, but these first 3 ways are very, very, very similar. If you just think about the first 3 ways and take them all together as just one argument, really, you can see that it's got a long history accepted by philosophers from all these great traditions throughout history. You have ancient pagan philosophers, Greek and Roman. You have Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Indian in the 10th century, early modern European. It is an argument that has been developed and endorsed widely, almost universally, for over 2,500 years. Here are the names of those philosophers. You've got Plato and Aristotle, ancient Greeks. You've got Plotinus, an ancient Roman. You've got Maimonides, Jewish. Al-Farabi and Avicenna and Averroes are Muslim. Udayana is that Indian philosopher we just mentioned from the era in the 10th century. Of course, you got medieval Christian scholars and philosophers, the scholastic. You've got early modern philosophers, most of whom are Christian. And then you've even got modern day guys from the 20th century and even up to today. Some of these guys are still living. Richard Swinburne, I've met him. He's still living. Last I heard, he's maybe in his 80s or 90s. Tim O'Connor and Alex Proust. Again, like I borrowed the content of most of the content of this PowerPoint from Rob Coons. So he mentions both of these in there, but it just so happens that 2 of these guys, Tim O'Connor and Alex Proust, are professors of mine, old professors of mine. So here's why I say this and why I include this and continue to include it in this PowerPoint, that if these guys over this long of a period, I'm not saying that this is an appeal to authority, but if this many people, this many traditions over this long of a time have endorsed these arguments as worthwhile and something to keep an eye on and something that they think is true and convincing and persuasive, if I'm coming to this like a very skeptical, atheist or something, that should at least give me pause to think, okay, I should at least listen to these, right? And the fact that you guys are here, perfect. I'm glad that you are, because you're at least going to listen to these arguments. Many people Like if I raise this online with just your everyday run-of-the-mill kind of internet philosopher type person, I don't know who these people are because many people are, on Reddit or YouTube. They're anonymous to me many times. If you raise these sorts of things, that they may just say, well, yeah, I've read the 5 ways and they're not that convincing. They're not that persuasive. Well, I don't know if you fully understand the 5 ways. That's the deal. And to dismiss it that easily when all of these famous philosophers and all these great traditions have endorsed that and thought they were persuasive seems to me like a connection error here. There's some sort of like, you're not seeing things, you're not getting what you're supposed to be getting. So that's why I like to look at these. So without further ado, let's jump in here. Now let's actually come here. And I'm going to show you this. I'm not sure. Can you guys see this, by the way? Can you see this? I hope that you can. This tab, because sometimes with copyright law, like with YouTube, sometimes you can't stream. I think that's an affirmation that you can. So this is Fredosso's translation page right here. As you can see, he's about to move. That's a new thing. I didn't even know that he was moving until today when I opened it up and saw that. But Fredosso, he says here, I've been present long into the admittedly foolhardy project of translating the whole of Summa. Will I ever finish? Well, at least I've started. So I love that attitude. But and then he says here, though I can't remember anymore exactly when I started. Like, that old saying, it's like, I've forgotten more than you will ever know or something. And that's basically what he's saying here. And so there, in the prima part, there's a massive amount of stuff here. But we are located in the prima part, it's the first part. There's also the first part of the second part of the second part, and the third part. So first part here, we're all the way down in question 2, not very far. Right there at the beginning, he's got like an introductory section, and then right here at the very beginning, we got to talk about the question of God's existence. That's what that looks like. Now, let me open up that document here in a different window. It looks like, actually, that's not that one. Sorry. I'm talking about this one here. Yeah, for some reason, it's not coming up. Yeah, that's the right one. That's the one I wanted. Okay, perfect. So this is question 2, the existence of God, what I just clicked on. You have to go Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. Article 3 is where we are. And it's kind of nice because it's like prima pars, that's 1. Question 2, Article 3. That's 1, 2, 3 right there, right in order. You got to scroll all the way down right here to Article 3. Is there a God? That's where we are. So I'll say this real quick. If you're not familiar with any of Aquinas' writings, if you've never opened them up, this can be really confusing to navigate, because this is what's called in this is called a disputatio, or a disputation, that is. In other words, it's a debate. So he's having a debate. And if you didn't know that, it would seem a little like schizophrenic. He's like confused and talking to himself, because he says, therefore there is no God. Well, Aquinas, I thought you were a Christian believer. I thought you were going to tell me God exists. So not all of these are Aquinas' own voice. For example, this is not his voice. The objections are contrary to this. But this, where he says in the response, this body right here, this would be the first way. This would be the second way. So the first here is very, very long. But he thinks the first is the clearest way. The clearest way to show that God is. Why are they called the 5 ways? Because he says right here, there are 5 ways to prove that there is God. So this is the first way, second way, and so on and so on. He's got third way, and then so on and so on. So we'll just look at the first 3 today. All right. So without further ado, sorry for that big wind up, but we're ready to actually look at the arguments. So this is what it looks like right here. The first way, argument for motion. Okay. Now, like I said, I borrowed this PowerPoint. I think I borrowed a lot of the elements from Rob Coombs down at University of Texas. But I don't know. I went back and looked at his PowerPoint just now, and I'm not sure if I borrowed this part. So I'm not sure where I got this. I might have gotten this from Alex Proust, perhaps. But anyway, so this is the first way, argument from motion. Okay. So you can see the premises, the conclusion, and so on. Now, let's just start with the premise. Premise 1. Our senses prove that some things are in motion. Okay. In other words, I look out into the world, and this is what I see. I see that things are moving, like very unobjectionable. So far, so good. Okay. Now, by the time we get to the conclusion, this is how logical arguments work. If I disagree with a conclusion, like he's of course going to say, well, everybody thinks this is God, we have a first mover, so on and so on, right? So we're going to arrive at God's existence here at the end. If I don't like that, for example, if I'm an atheist, I cannot just naysay the conclusion. Well, I can disagree with the conclusion, but I can't just disagree with it. I have to, if I disagree with the conclusion, go back up here in the premises and find something that went wrong with the argument, because of course the argument is valid. We're assuming the argument is valid, but if all of these premises are true as well, then the conclusion follows from that. So as you're going through this argument, keep that in mind. Think, okay, what is it that seems sketchy or wrong about this? Which one of these premises would I reject? And just do that as an exercise. Even if you're a believer, you're a theist, a Christian, Catholic, whatever it may be, just try to do this. Try to find something in the argument that is fishy or sketchy or whatever. Okay. But premise one here, I don't think would be one of them. Premise one, our senses prove. I look out into the world, I see that some things are in motion. Like I said, very unobjectionable. Like there's nothing to object there, right? Okay. What about premise two? Things move when potential motion becomes actual motion. All right. What does that mean? This requires some definitional work. Okay. So actual motion, that just means that things are moving currently. Potential motion obviously means that it's not currently actively moving. Potential motion means something like at rest. Okay. So this literally means things move when things at rest go into motion. Okay. So if I'm teaching on this, I'd be like, all right, anybody object to that? And nobody does, right? Because that's, again, just, so far so good. Like this is just a definitional sort of thing, right? Things move when potential motion becomes actual. Things move when things at rest go into motion. That's just definitional. That's what it means to move. Okay. You might quibble with some terminology, but given that we understand how language works, I can't object to that. Okay. So far so good. Premise 1 and 2 are pretty unassailable. There's nothing to argue with. What about premise 3? Only an actual motion can convert a potential motion into an actual motion. What about that one? Well, this means, again, only something that is moving can make something at rest move. That seems true too. In fact, that seems one of like Newton's laws of motion, right? Which is pretty crazy when you think about it, because Aquinas is writing this in the 1200s, right? And we like to think that Newton came up with these like laws of thermodynamics, laws of motion, and so on. But here he is in the 1200s. He's formulating this as one of the premises in his argument. And in fact, these 5 ways, I didn't mention this, but these 5 ways, they don't come from Aquinas. They actually come from Aristotle. These 5 ways in the form that they are, all five, which is, I think, significant because, again, pagan philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, and so on, they had these arguments. They weren't known as being very spiritual or religious authors, but they did have arguments for God's existence. They did believe in deity. So only something in motion can make something at rest go into motion. Again, I don't know any way to object to that, so I'm just going to keep going. Let's see, premise 4. Nothing can be at once in both actuality and potentiality in the same respect. In other words, nothing can be both moving and at rest. Okay, maybe, right? So here's an interesting thing. So like, perhaps this is one the first spot that I can find wiggle room. If you were going to object, this would be here, right? Because like, let's think about like, I'm moving, well, I'm at rest right now. I'm sitting, and I'm also hurtling around the sun and spinning on Earth's orbit, right? On its axis. That's movement. So I'm both moving and at rest. So doesn't that seem to contradict what he's saying here? Or what if I'm asleep, right? I'm both at rest, and then also my body, my neural activity and so on, and my heart and my lungs, right? that's motion, that's movement, and yet I'm at rest. So boom, contradiction. There you have it. Proves premise 4 wrong, right? No, not right. Because this part that I don't have highlighted, these small words like in the same respect and at once, these are really important. So this means it can't happen at the same time. This one means that they have to happen in the same sense. Okay, so I have to be both in motion and at rest in the same respect. And that's not what's happening in the examples I described. Right when I'm asleep, I'm not both at rest and moving with respect to being, I'm not both awake and asleep at the same time. Or my body is not both neural activity and at rest in neural activity, no neural activity. No, that would not work. That'd be contradictory. Or I'm at rest in my seat, but I'm also not at rest in my seat. No, I'm both moving around the sun and not moving around the sun. No, right? So that's what he's saying. Like, I can't both be moving and at rest in the same respect. All the examples I've given have been in different respects. I'm sitting in my seat and I'm hurtling around the sun. Those are moving and at rest in different respects. I'm not both sitting in my seat and not sitting in my seat. I'm not both hurtling around the sun and not hurtling around the sun. That would be a contradiction. And of course, this small phrase at once, you can't, you could be moving and at rest at different times, sure, but we're talking about the same time, of course. That's probably what we assume. So as long as we understand what premise 4 is saying, it's really hard to object to this. So what about this next premise? Therefore, nothing can move itself. Now, we have actually reached, like, we see conclusion right here and a therefore right here. And based on what I said about conclusions, right, if you naysay conclusion, you got to go up here and find something. Well, this is actually, I should probably relabel this instead of just premise 5. It should be like conclusion 1. We've actually got another, this could be conclusion 2. This could be conclusion 3, ultimate conclusion. So there's no new information here in this conclusion 1 here, or premise 5. This is just a summary of what has already been said. It's an inference based on what we've already established. So again, nothing can move itself. If you think this is wrong, there's something up here that you've got to reject. It does seem wrong though, right? Because I can move myself. Well, you have to understand what he means by this. Nothing can move itself. In other words, nothing can make itself begin to move itself. Nothing can make itself begin to move if it wasn't already moving. I can like go to sleep and then I can wake up. That seems like beginning to move myself like every new day. However, that's not what he's talking about at the beginning of movement at all. Like I would have to, if there is no movement in a thing at all, that would mean it would be dead. Like if there's absolutely no movement, that would mean I'm dead. But there's constant movement, right? There's constant movement. And so it's not the case that I'm ever completely at rest. Something that's completely at rest would be dead. Now, I am not moving myself in the sense of making myself begin to move itself. I don't have that power because I'm already moving it. My neurons are already firing. My lungs are already going, so on and so forth. In other words, I can't make myself move if I've never have been moving ever, to start with. So again, since this is a conclusion, and as long as we understand what it's saying, not like I can't make myself get up out of the chair and walk around, but I can't make myself begin to move if I had never been moving before. As long as we understand the meaning of what's being claimed here, then it just follows from up here. And if I don't like that, we have to understand it's just restating what we said above. So if we accepted all 4 premises so far, this is something we should just accept. And if you don't want to accept it, that's fine. That's up to you. But you have to find something in the first 4 premises to be like, no, I don't agree with that. So the second conclusion follows from the first conclusion. There's no additional premises. I'm not sure really who originated this, the argument in these premises, but I did go back and compare this to the actual article from Aquinas, and this is almost spot on. Some of these are out of order, but that's because just for rhetorical sense. But look at premise 6 or conclusion 2. Therefore, each thing in motion is moved by something else. Or another thing. In other words, if something is in motion, it got its original movement put into motion by something else. All right. So again, I can't make myself begin to move at the beginning of my existence. You know, my parents had to like make myself move in the very beginning, not like intentionally, not trying to make me move, but you know, they're responsible for the origin of my existence. And so, well, they were moving before, and so on and so on. This goes back into history. It's like a long line of dominoes, right? And he says this sequence of motion cannot extend ad infinitum, infinity into the past. There has to be something right here. Therefore, it's necessary to arrive at a first mover, put in motion by no other, and everyone understands this to be God. Now, let me pull this back up. Sorry about that. Now, so in other words, imagine a line of dominoes, like I just explained. If there are dominoes falling, and this is also helpful in the next argument, the argument from cause and effect, because it's basically, like I said, 1, 2, and 3 are very, very similar. So there's cause and effect happening in the first way, there's motion happening, but the same idea applies, right? So line of dominoes, if I see dominoes falling right here, if I see dominoes falling right here, which I admitted I did, right? Because that's the first premise. I admitted I see movement. I admitted I see it happening right now. And it had to start. It was moved by another thing, moved by, there's a domino and before that, and a domino before that, and a domino, and so on and so on. It can't extend on into infinity in the past, because what I mean by extending infinitely into the past is that there was no beginning, no first domino to fall. If there's no first domino to fall, that means that there would be no movement right now. There would be no dominoes right now. The fact that there are dominoes falling right now means it started to fall. If there was never, because I know it's hard to conceive of infinity, but we're talking about infinitely into the past. There is no beginning. So if there's no beginning, there's no first domino. And if there's no first domino to fall ever, then there can't be dominoes falling now. But like we said, if there are dominoes falling now, that means that there had to be some first domino that falls. And that's what he calls the first mover. He calls this the first mover. You can also think about this as, I'll put this in parentheses, first mover or unmoved mover. You'll sometimes hear. The idea he said here, and I'm paraphrasing here, a first mover put in motion by no other, right? Because this would be something that's quite unique. I know atheists don't like this because they see it as special pleading, which is a fallacy. But special pleading is only a fallacy if it's unjustifiable special pleading. In this case, at reason's demand, we have to say, well, this had to have happened necessarily, and it had to have happened by something that wasn't put in motion by anything other. Now, Aquinas thinks this is the clearest argument. I think when you couple it with the second way, it's actually even clearer. But basically the same argument, but line of dominoes again. The third one's going to be very similar, but the third one's very different. It's not linear like dominoes. But this one's very similar. Second way. Let's go to the second way. Argument from efficient causes, or in other words, argument from cause and effect. That's what efficient causation means. And it starts off the very same way, right? So we perceive a series of efficient causes of things in the world. In other words, I look out into the world, I see that things cause other things. That's all this is claiming. So again, if I'm looking for a premise to object to, this is not it. This is pretty unobjectionable. Down here, we can go ahead and peek ahead to see what he's going to conclude to, just because it's nice to know what he's going to land upon. And again, it's something like first efficient cause, right? So first, sometimes this goes in the literature as first cause or uncaused cause. So I'll put both in there, first cause or uncaused cause, either way. But the idea is the same. It's going to be a first cause and it's going to be not anything causing it. So the idea is the same, right? So I start out looking out at the world, things cause other things, unobjectionable. Premise 2, what about this one? Is this hard? And look, we're already reaching our first conclusion here in premise 3. So if we object to this, then we got to find something up here to object to. So far, we don't have anything. But what about this one? Nothing exists prior to itself. This seems obvious. I don't exist prior to myself. But you might think, here's a way you could object to this. You might think, well, I mean, there's some religions that believe in reincarnation, right? So like before I was in this body, I existed prior in some prior mode or way. Maybe I was a fly in a prior life or something. Or even in some forms, Abrahamic faiths, they believe, like some forms of Christianity, they think that God creates the soul and then, it kind of puts it in the body, right? So maybe I exist prior to myself that way. No. Let me explain. Let's just take the soul example, the creation of the soul, and God plops it into your body. Talk about whatever you want to talk about, but we're talking about you. Like if you're your body, most people don't think this, but imagine if you are your body. Your body did not exist before your body. Okay, you want to talk about your soul. Well, your soul did not exist before your soul. In order to exist before you exist, that's a contradiction, right? Because here's the threshold. Something begins to exist. It goes this way, let's say. So it goes this way on the timeline, right? And there's a prior time at which it exists. So I start my existence here, and then I begin to exist. I extend my timeline that way. Prior to my first existence, do I not exist? Yeah, I don't exist because I start to exist here. But you're saying I exist prior to my existence as well. So over here, we're saying I both exist and don't exist. Sorry, buddy, that's a contradiction. So this is just incoherent to say that anything exists prior to itself existing. Okay. So far, these two premises are just rock solid. There's no way of getting out of them. Therefore, nothing is the efficient cause of itself. And this one's pretty easy to accept as well. Obviously, we accepted the premises before, but nothing causes itself to begin to exist. Sorry. So if you're thinking, by the way, if you're thinking of God as self-caused, that's actually incoherent. There's three possibilities when it comes to God's coming to be, or let's say responsible for his existence. So we can think of God being, there's three options. Let me say caused by another thing. 2, being self-caused, which we just ruled out. Or 3, being uncaused. And of course, if you're looking ahead and you're looking back to this first uncaused cause, there's going to be uncaused cause, but it just makes sense, right? So is God caused by another thing? No, because that would make him, reliant, and we'll see actually in this argument on why God can't be caused by another thing, because the first cause can't be caused by another thing. Self-causation, we just ruled out in this third premise. Nothing is the efficient cause of itself. Nothing can cause itself to begin to exist. It's just impossible, because in order to cause myself to begin to exist, I would have to exist before I exist, and that's a contradiction. Okay, so far so good. We are through that. Now, number 4, and looking ahead, we have another therefore up here. So this I guess maybe is a critical premise. So if we don't toss it, we have to agree to this conclusion. But let's look at it. If a previous sufficient cause does not exist, neither does the thing that results. So in other words, there's going to be no effect if there's no cause. That's all that's saying. If there's no cause, then there's no effect. I mean, that's hard to object to, honestly. I mean, some people will here at this point, they'll say, well, what about quantum mechanics, quantum indeterminacy? Things can just pop into existence without having any cause whatsoever. No, I'm sorry to say, but I think when theoretical physicists talk like this, they're not very philosophically trained, because they're making philosophical claims, even though they're not philosophers. They're making philosophical claims and they're getting confused. What they are describing is that with quantum indeterminacy, I think they're making ontological or metaphysical claims about what exists and things not having causes, when they should be making epistemological claims, like we don't know what the cause was, or that the cause is indiscernible or something like that. But it's a quite different claim to say that some effect can happen not with no discernible cause. That would be an epistemological claim, but an effect can happen with no cause whatsoever. That's an ontological claim. That's a major, major claim. And if that happens, as you'll see later in the slideshow, disastrous results come about. So basically, this more or less, even if you can flag this if you don't like it, and we'll come back to it. We can say more about it here in a minute, but we'll proceed. But basically, if you don't have a cause, then you don't have an effect. That's the way most cause and effect works. Most causation works. So it should be pretty unobjectionable, if not universally unobjectionable. So if we accept that, we get to the second conclusion, or premise 5. Therefore, if the first thing in a series does not exist, nothing in the series exists. Starting to sound a lot like that first way, right? If the first domino doesn't exist, then the last domino won't exist. And the series of efficient causes can't extend ad infinitum into the past, then there would be no existing things now. Therefore, it's necessary to emit a first efficient cause. In other words, again, like we said, very similar to the first way with motion, except you might be like, well, why are these two arguments if they're basically the same thing? Well, because you can have causation without motion. We don't like to, well, it's not like we don't like to. We don't often think of these as separate, but they are distinct concepts, motion and causation. But you can have, like, they very often go together, right, in physical causation, right? Because anytime something has physical causation, then it's going to have motion as well, because it has movement within the physical world. But you can have, like I said, causation without motion. It's what's called simultaneous causation, right? So pick a time, any time slice of history, time t right now, for example. I'm sitting in this seat, right? No motion is happening with my rump, but my butt is currently depressing the chair, like performing the depression in the seat on the chair. That is a cause with an effect, but there's no movement happening. So what we have is simultaneous causation. So this is just one easy example, but very often they go together. You almost always have causation with motion, but they can come apart. And so it's important to have the concepts different as well. So that's why we have two arguments. So cause and effect, back to this, like I say, it's going to be very similar to the argument of motion. If you have a line of dominoes, I look out into the world, I see that dominoes are falling now on this side of things, they're happening. It's got to have started at some point, because if we say that it extends infinitely into the past, that means that there would be no beginning. That's what infinity means. I go way back there was never a beginning. Well, if there's never a first domino to fall, then there wouldn't be dominoes falling now. That's just what logic demands. So there had to be at least one to start the whole thing off, right? There had to be the starting, let's say, the starting of the falling for it to be falling now. At some point, however far back, it started to fall. That's all this is saying, right? Because if it never started to fall, it wouldn't be falling now. That's all we're saying. And so at some point, however far back, however maybe not far back, we don't know. He's not making a commitment to anything about that. He's saying that at some point there was a first efficient cause. Now, let me say something that I should have said earlier, but I kind of got distracted because I wanted to connect the first and the second way as being very, very similar. But he says here, the second way, to which everything gives the name of God. And then over here, he says, well, and everyone understands this to be God, with the argument from motion, and this argument from efficient causes. That seems to come way out of left field. Like, the argument does not ever get you to that. So many people, I think this is, maybe if you're skeptical about this, if you're an atheist, for example, this is kind of easy, low-hanging fruit here to like complain about this point, because, oh, he's saying this is God, but he hasn't proven that. Well, he's not trying to prove that that is the God of Trinitarian Christological theology of the Orthodox Christian faith. He's not trying to prove that, but it all depends on his audience, right? His audience for the Summa it's this massive volume. He says in the very beginning, that introductory chapter or question that we started with, like it'd be the prima pars question 1, that introductory portion. He says, this is for beginners in theology. This is who he's addressing to. I'm writing to begin. Of course, he didn't mean beginners like elementary school children. He meant somebody who's like first starting out their studies. Maybe they had a college degree equivalent like we would have now, but they were maybe studying to be priests. And so they were starting like graduate school in theology. So basically, so in other words, that meant beginners in theology. So that's who it's for. So he's writing to people who are going to become priests. This is who the audience he is intending. And so he doesn't have to really prove. It's almost like this wink, wink. Hey, guys, you know what I'm talking about, basically, at this point. I mean, so look, if his audience were different, then if his audience were all atheists, by all means, he probably would have said, well, I've got more work to do. I've got more premises for you in order to show why this is this specific God of this specific religion. But we don't get that here. It's also important to point out that where did I put it? Oh, I must have. Oh, there we go. Yeah, right here. With this, the Summa, this is not the only section where he talks about God's existence. In fact, it's not the only work. The Summa is not the only work that he talks about God's existence. And these are only kind of like an introductory survey. This is a intro level survey. This is why you often get it in Intro to Philosophy. You get this intro level, just dipping your toe into thinking about God's existence for the very first time. This is not the final word Aquinas has ever said on the existence of God, as you can see. He's got a lot more things to say. So don't think that this is the final say. In order to get his entire take on God's existence, why God must exist, gosh, you would have to read things like, I don't know, the De Veritate on truth. You would have to read the De Malo. You'd have to read maybe Disputed Questions of Virtue. There are all these works. In fact, let me show you this, by the way. I think most people don't realize, they're familiar with the Summa, perhaps. They've heard of it. They don't realize that. So this is what's called Thomas Aquinas' Opera Omnia. Omnia means all, like omni is in all, like omniscient, all omnipotent. Opera is actually the plural form for opus, like a work. So this literally means all his works ever. And these are all in Latin. So you have his major works here, right here. You have Summa Contra Gentiles, as I mentioned earlier in the stream. You have Summa Theologiæ here. And it's actually quite massive, but it doesn't do this justice because there's not very many here. You've got the Disputed Questions. You've got on truth, De Veritate, I just mentioned here. Potentiality or power here. You got the questions on the soul, questions on evil, De Malo I mentioned. All of these, like there's a lot of stuff here that Aquinas has written. And if you see my scroll bar, I don't know if you can see that right there on the live stream, but I'm only about halfway. There's massive, massive amounts of works here. Of course, not all these are translated. They're all in Latin on that page. So anybody who gives this criticism of Aquinas, for example, that says, these are bad arguments, and because he hasn't proven that the Christian God exists, that's low-hanging fruit. He never intended to give the entire definitive proof, the end-all be-all. He never come back to this issue whatsoever. Like, there are other resources on this, obviously in other philosophers, but especially even in Aquinas. This is not the only thing he's ever said on this. So that is important to remember. So when he's saying, go back to our argument here, it's necessary to admit a first cause. All this argument, this single one right here, let's just think about the second way in isolation, this one in particular. All the second way seeks to establish is that there's a first cause. That's it. And then he kind of bumps, hey, wink, wink to my seminarians. We, of course, know what we're talking about here. This is God. Of course, if his audience were different, he would explain more about that. And he does elsewhere. So now it's important to say here, let me say something here. So usually I have a chart that I make on the whiteboard when I'm teaching on this, but I think I can probably replicate it here in the chat box. So think about this. We've got, let's just say the first way, right? We've got argument for motion to a first mover, unmoved mover, let's say. So in other words, we've got title of the argument, motion, argument for motion. We've also got, I would draw a second box here. I'd say, okay, well, on this column, so first column, what's the name of the argument? Argument for motion. Second column, this column, first unmoved, it's what the conclusion is. What does he conclude to? Okay. In this case, he concludes to a first unmoved mover. And then I draw a third column, and I would label this one attributes. I would label this third column attributes. In other words, even though he is concluding, just to be clear, he's concluding to a first mover, a first unmoved mover, not the Christian God. What can we infer based on that conclusion alone, what this kind of thing would be? Okay, this is, I don't think atheists give this enough attention. What kind of thing would this be? Well, it wouldn't be just a domino. Let's put it that way. If this thing, and again, the second way would be argument from causation. Let me put this in here, and then first uncaused cause. And I think the attributes are similar for both. So I draw another row. First column goes causation. Second column right here goes uncaused cause. Then the third column attributes. It's going to share very similar between motion and causation, those two arguments. What the attributes would be. We can infer that this thing, whatever this thing is, not going to be a domino. It's going to be very powerful. Not omnipotent, not all powerful necessarily. It's going to be very powerful, right? Because this is just it's an old principle of physics. Energy can be neither created nor destroyed, and that the conservation of energy, and that the effect has to have within it about the same energy or power or what have you, I forget how it's phrased, equal to or less than the cause of what that effect is. So this means that, take the universe altogether as a whole, the entire cosmos, multiverse, whatever, everything that's in existence. Think about all the power, all the energy in it, all the vastness of it. We're talking about that the power has to be equal to or less than whatever the cause was. So if we're following that principle, that means the cause of all this has to be massively, extremely powerful to set something like that off. It's probably also based on the first way for motion. It is moving. That one seems weird, but let's say more about it, right? It is moving. In other words, it is active. That means it is probably living. Because what did I say earlier? If I'm entirely at rest, if I'm completely at rest, that means none of my bodily functions are moving, my neurons aren't firing, my lungs aren't going, my blood's not pumping. If I'm entirely at rest, that means I'm dead. So we're talking about something that is moving, not only moving, but nothing caused it to move. It was unmoved by anything else. So it's been moving for a very long time, and it's been active for a very long time, eternally moving. Why eternal? Well, because again, nothing would have moved it. It is unmoved by anything else. So it would have been eternally in this state of moving and active. And interestingly, the Israelites called Jehovah God, the living God. They call him the living God. And I think this is very telling. All right. So I'm going to pause here. I like this comment from Exy Music. And I've seen a couple of the comments as well that I want to get to. Thanks for being here, first of all. And then we'll jump back into the third way and round this out. But so this is a very common, Exy Music says here, God needs a cause. Uncaused cause is made up nonsensical phrase. We do have the power with language symbols to create non-existent things and principles. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Maybe you can expand upon it. I don't think uncaused cause is just a made up nonsensical phrase. Let me address that first, then we'll address the first part. Because this is the idea that, again, just following logically, like, feel free, if you don't like the conclusion, go up to one of the premises and tell us where the argument went wrong, right? I'm not saying that it's like a prove it. I'm not trying to be a jerk about that, but I'm saying this because we arrive at an uncaused cause, not as just this arbitrary thing that we like to throw around, this phrase that we like to throw around. It's because it's logically required based on the steps that we took to get there. The causes cannot proceed into infinity, from infinity into the past. It had to start somewhere. It had to cause other things. That's what we mean by first cause. And if it's causing other things, it's the first one, that means that it had to be uncaused. Well, why would it be uncaused? Because if it were caused itself, it would keep going and keep going and keep going. It has to stop somewhere. Now, to your first point, God needs a cause. That is a very, very common criticism. Who, or let's say what, caused God? Now, I think it's an easy, immediate criticism, like the idea of like, oh yeah, but I think upon reflection, it's a very silly criticism. Not to say that you're silly for thinking it, because I think it's a very, very natural first reaction, let's say, right? Because if everything has cause, why wouldn't God? Well, if we're thinking back to this line of causation, if I had a dang whiteboard or something, I'm talking to my wife about maybe getting like an iPad with like an Apple Pen, so I can just kind of stream that as well, being like just like in the classroom. But anyway, until then, we're gonna have to just use hand movements, I suppose. Anyway, so we have this chain of causes, right? It's proceeding this way. Imagine this is the beginning, and this is what we're calling the FC, the first cause. Okay, this is the first cause. Now, the objection says that can't be God. Or sorry, no, that's not what the objection. The objection says, so first cause, in other words, God. God exists right here. The objection says, well, there had to be something that caused God. Okay, I'm fine with that. If you want to say that, there had to be something that caused the first cause. Well, in that case, though, to see how silly this is that then this thing would not be the first cause. It would be the first cause plus one. This thing over here would be the first cause. And I think theists would just be like, well, we identify God as whatever the first cause is. So if you want to say that this wasn't the first cause, we don't agree that that's God, because God is going to be something that's all powerful. God is going to be the origin of all these causes. Okay, well, if this has a cause right here, is this going to be the first cause? And you're going to say, no, it's going to keep backing up. And the argument's going to start all over. You're eventually going to have to get a real first cause. You're going to eventually have to arrive at a real first cause, uncaused by nothing else. That's what the argument shows. Okay. And theists will just say, well, we don't care about this first cause plus 200. That's not what we're interested in. We're concerned about this one that we identify as the first cause. That's the one we mean by God. So just to say that, well, what caused God, that just misunderstands the argument, actually. Okay. Now I want to keep going onto the third way. The third way is really radically different. So, well, not so different. It's just not linear. We've been using the example of dominoes falling and motion and causation and all that. It's going to follow that, but it's not going to be linear. Okay. So let's start out with premise one. We find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be. Okay. This requires an explanation as to some terminology. So a contingent, something that's contingent, right? Something that's contingent means something that could either exist or not exist. That's what he's saying here. Something that is contingent. Okay. Something that either consist or not exist. Like I am contingent because I could just as well just not be here. The trees outside my window are contingent. You know, if the seed or acorn or whatever fell a different way or rolled down the hill or got picked up and eaten by a bird, it would not exist. The tree would not exist there. So actually most things in the universe, especially in the natural world, are contingent. They can either be or not to be. And then he says this, that come into being and go out of being. That's just what it means by definition to be a contingent being. Okay. So this first premise, as long as we understand, maybe we're first learning the word, but once we understand what contingent means, we can all agree that there are some things in the world that are contingent, things that can either exist or not exist, come into being and go out of being. That's just by definition of what it means to be contingent. So again, unobjectionable. I look out into the world. Again, it's an empirical starting point, which I appreciate. I look out into the world. I'm not just using my brain to do this, locked up in the ivory tower. I look out into the world. This is what I see. I see that some things are contingent. That's it. Now, the way the argument goes from there is different from the first two. He reaches an assumption. Now, this is a reductio ad absurdum argument. Let me write that here. Reductio, come on, ad absurdum. And, since you have access to the internet, maybe you can go and look at what a reductio ad absurdum is and the way it works. But basically, let me try to explain here. For a minute, forget that these are actually populated premises. Just imagine these are all blank so we can talk through them. I'm not highlighting the actual content of these. I'm just highlighting the lines. This is the way a reductio works. I start with an assumption, and I have this whole indented portion right here. And to reductio ad absurdum, that means to reduce to the absurd. I eventually want to reach an absurd result. Or in other words, an absurd result in the sense of a contradiction. I want to assume something, and I want to reach a contradiction. Why would I want to do that? Well, because by design, a nice way to argue with the reductio is you assume something you actually want to prove the opposite of. So strategically speaking, if you use reductio, you assume the opposite. So for example, if we use these all the time in informal reasoning. So for example, let's suppose I'm trying to prove to you that I'm married. Right? I would assume, as my assumption, well, suppose, for argument's sake, I'm not married. And then I'd populate the rest of the premises, and in the indented part, I'd say, well, if I'm not married, then I wouldn't have a wedding ring on. But I do have a wedding ring on. That's just a premise I can add because I'm looking at it. Or if I'm married, then I wouldn't have a wedding certificate. Well, I do have a wedding certificate. And already I've gotten to two contradictions. I only need one. But once I reach a contradiction or an absurd result from the assumption that I've inserted, I can then, so this should probably be indented for impact here, because that's the way you do it in a formal logical proof. But I can then output or spit out my function. I can spit out a conclusion that is the opposite of my assumption. So this assumption was every being is a contingent being. My conclusion right here is going to be not every being is a contingent being. That's just the opposite. This is a negation of what I assumed. Or in the example I gave, assume I'm not married. I reach some absurd result, some contradiction. My generated conclusion popping out of that is going to be, well, I guess I'm married because I reached a contradiction from that assumption. So that's how reductio works. It's actually a really clever way to argue. It's a very common way to argue. You'll see it in the wild quite often, actually. So anyway, so assuming here, he says, I assume, for instance, every being is a contingent being. And this is not hard to assume, actually, because as I said up here, maybe they're almost everything is a contingent being. There's a lot of things out there that either can exist or not exist, like trees and rocks and even whole planets and me and you, right? They can go into being, they can come out of being, right? They can, be created and destroyed and all that, right? So assume everything. Just assume a universe in which everything in it is a contingent being, okay? So let me give you this. I'm a visual learner, so I've got this really terrible drawing here. I'm using this stupid app here. So here's my universe, a blue dot, right? All the universe. So I'm going to assume, right here, scroll down, that everything in my universe is a contingent being. So that's where he is so far. So let me go back to the argument. Then, for each contingent being, there is a time at which it does not exist, right? Because that's just what it means to be a contingent being, right? Because they can come into being and go out of being. They can be created and destroyed, okay? Therefore, it's impossible for these to have always existed. That's just, by definition, what it means to be a contingent being. But we're saying impossible for all of these things to exist. Therefore, there could have been a time at which no things existed. If no things existed, then there would have been nothing to bring the currently existing contingent beings into existence. Let me show you visually what I depict this to look like, and really terrible drawing here. So we have here, right? We have all of our contingent beings, our universe. I scroll down here, each one causes another thing. I think it started with this one. Let's make this red, for example. That's the starting point, okay? And they all cause another thing. But if we go follow it backwards, it's not linear like the dominoes in ways 1 and 2, but it's the same idea. Right? It's more circular, I suppose, but it's the same idea. This contingent being, well, what could cause this one? This one had to come into existence in the beginning. You might say, what was the last one? Well, that's just a vicious circle. That's not going to work. So if there was nothing to bring the beings into causation, there's going to be a time at which it never existed, then none of these things should be existing now. But that's what we started with. That's what we started with. The idea that our first premise, I look out into the world, I see that things are existing. Well, therefore nothing would be existence now. That's my absurd result. That's my contradiction. The idea that nothing exists now, based on the way I just argued, nothing exists now. And, well, that contradicts this because there are things that exist now. So that's my explicit contradiction. No things exist now. Things do exist now, explicitly contradicts each other. We've reached a contradiction as a result from assuming every being is a contingent being. So we have to trash this assumption and conclude the opposite. Therefore, not every being is a contingent being. There has to be, let me go back to my other one. There has to be at least one being that is necessary. Right here, it looks like this. One being that is necessary. And he says, some being exists of its own necessity, does not receive its existence from another being, but rather causes them. So let me bring that back to you. Back to the argument. Not everything is contingent being. Therefore, if not everything, there's at least one. Now, here's a thing that you could argue at this point, and this is totally legitimate. This does not exclude or preclude the possibility of polytheism, because all this argument says is there must be at least one. He says some being exists of his own. At least one thing is a necessary being, okay? And this is just by logic and reason using this. There has to be at least one being that is necessary. There could be more, right? It doesn't rule that out, not this argument. He says, exists of his own necessity and does not receive existence from another being, but rather causes other thing. And of course, he thinks this is God. Now, again, if I were to think of attributes for this thing, now I know that this thing has to be a necessary being. And it's not unusual for something to have necessity, right? Well, I guess it is unusual because not everything has it. Very few things do have it, but there are things that do have it. Numbers have it, right? Like for example, the number 3. The number 3 is a necessary. It's not a being. It does exist, so it has existence in that respect, but it's not a being. It's more like an object, right? So, but this is not the number 3 we're talking about, because again, like if I'm trying to infer attributes of what this thing would be, this necessary being, it probably also has agency in the sense that it is an actor. It can act, right? Because agency actually comes from the word agere in Latin, which means to act. So an agent just means somebody who acts. Why think that? Well, again, because 3 is a necessary object. The number 3, all mathematical objects are necessary. All mathematical truths are necessary. All logical truths are necessary. In other words, they can't possibly, 1 and 1 equals 2. That couldn't possibly be otherwise, as long as you understand what 1 and 2 mean. That's not contingent, in other words. But those things are truths that are necessary. They're not beings that are necessary. To have a necessary being means that it would act. Why not think this is the number 3 that could have? Well, because number 3 doesn't act. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't act upon. Like, I use the number 3 in computations, and equations, but it doesn't act upon me in any sense. So yeah, it would not have volition. It would not have, because like a dead domino that is unactive at the very beginning, let's say, it has no acting power whatsoever. It's going to remain at rest. That's just laws of motion, right? So something that had to kick off the whole thing, this extraordinary chain of events to get to us today, that can't be just something like a number 3 that has no active power. So, all right. I appreciate you guys hanging in here. So I got to one of these comments about uncaused cause and how, what caused God, and explain that. So X Music says this as well. Good. Yeah. And Jesus Love You is responding to this. So he says, so many theoretical physicists or cosmologists promote an eternal universe model with no issues about infinite regress. The ancient Greeks believed in an eternal universe. And I have heard this user, Jesus Loves You, is saying that, I have heard both ways. I've heard that Aquinas thinks you can prove a temporal beginning to the universe, and I've heard that Aquinas thinks that you cannot prove a temporal beginning to the universe in time, its beginning, and that perhaps it's infinite. I seem to think, and maybe I'm alone on this, but I seem to think that if you follow the 5 ways, that would necessarily establish at least a beginning to the universe. I mean, obviously, but a temporal beginning, it depends on what you mean by that. I mean, do you mean that all of it, and this gets into like deep metaphysics with respect to the metaphysics of time. Do you believe A theory? Do you believe B theory? A theory is the idea of like a moving timeline that you experience as you go by. B is the idea that it's kind of hard to explain, but like that all things on the timeline are existent at once, and perhaps if that's the way it goes, then God could say be this external viewer and see everything at once. Is how he can tell the future. Anyway, not to get into the weeds with that, but if you believe in a theory of time, that first one, like you're on a timeline, you use experiences as you go by, it'd be hard to say how God, in his experience of things, created the universe and created time. It would seem that if you're, like we said, active, living, presumably God's also thinking his thoughts and so on, contemplating and so on, conversing with the other members of the Trinity, of course, and in union with them. If you're doing that, then that's not happening outside of time. That would require time, presumably. I mean, these are the mysteries of God. They're really hard to understand, but that would seem, and if that's the case, and that requires time, then time did not start when the universe began. So that would be an argument that when the universe began, there was no beginning of time. Time began prior to that, or perhaps just maybe the A model, the A theory of time is just wrong, and the B theory of time is more accurate, and all these things exist simultaneously with God in his mind. That's also a live possibility as well. I'm not about to do a it's been years since I've thought about the metaphysics of time. I'm not about to do a stream or a video on the metaphysics of time. There are way better people out there that can do that for you if you're interested in that. That's one of those things, like, for me, like, I can do the 5 ways. I'm fine with that. I teach them. But if you wanted to get into deeper things like this, there, Alex Bruce, Tim O'Connor, Rob Coons, those guys who write on these things. I don't think Coons, I don't know if he's Catholic actually, but I know Tim O'Connor recently reconverted to Catholicism. Alex Bruce is well-known Catholic. If you're interested in that. And, but they get really into the weeds with this stuff with, like, Proust, by the way, he has 2 doctorates. He has a doctorate in mathematics and a doctorate in philosophy. And so he can do all that high level work on infinity that I'm just like, blown away by. Like, I'm glad there are other people that can do that, because that is not what I signed up to do when I signed up for philosophy. No, thank you. But if you're interested in that work, definitely I'll put his name here again. Definitely track down Alex Proust. His work on infinity is some of the best stuff that I know of. I mean, I don't know many people who do work on infinity, but because I know Alex Proust personally, I'd recommend him. I trust him, and I know he's a leader in that field. If you are a specialist in this area and you don't like Proust, well, I suppose you have that view. That's fine. I mean, I'm just recommending him because I know he's great at what he does. The stuff that I can't understand, that is. Let's see if I can get to some of the comments here before we wrap up. Okay. I like this stuff. Okay. Aristotle wasn't making arguments for a creator God, so there's a difference between the two men. Perhaps. Yeah. It's interesting to note that this is seldom taught in philosophy, in academic philosophy, in the university, that Aristotle had arguments for the divine. Seldom taught also that Socrates received wisdom from the divine, the oracle. You'll hear about this, but they don't really emphasize all that much, like what that means, what would that entail. I mean, Socrates was a religious person. Probably also the same for Plato, since he also endorsed this argument. But it's wildly, like, it seems prejudiced in my view, like, that you would get an education in philosophy and these things not be revealed to you. For example, I can think of other examples like Anselm's ontological argument. You know, most people don't know this, while they may be familiar with the ontological argument, that it's from Anselm and his Prologion. They don't realize that it, unless they've read the darn thing and the prologue before it, they don't realize that it's a prayer, it's a devotion. And he was writing a prayer. Same thing with Augustine's Confessions. Same thing even with Descartes and his Meditations. Like, that is written in a prayerful, devotional mode. And it's just fascinating to me that we kind of, in our secular world, in our secular mindset, where we just kind of, don't give me religion, nonsense, right? They will just kind of harvest the things from the Christian worldview. They'll be like, oh, we're okay with it. At least we can learn some things. We'll learn about Anselm's argument, but forget about that devotional stuff. That seems really irresponsible to me, because I don't think that you can really understand the one without the other. And it's really fascinating to me. Even Christians who know, like I said, about the ontological argument, unless they've read it, and even if they have, they skip that part. It's like, well, that's not the important part. Like, I wonder how that would change us as believers if we actually took seriously, not just trying to mine the rationalist arguments out of Anselm's ontological argument, for example, but if we like prayerfully worked through them. I wonder how that would change one's perspective. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. So, so XE Music says here, he's talking about the attributes of God. He says concepts of God follow an orderly evolution. The omni concepts, that is, the omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, even omnibenevolence, these are understood to be classical attributes of God, in the sense of like philosophical, like there is what's known as the God of the philosophers, by the way. And this is probably what you get out of Aquinas and the Five Ways and all these other traditions that endorse these arguments. You get the God of the philosophers. He's not going to be very personal. He's not going to answer prayers. But you get this thing. Now, I'm not saying that's not the Christian God. I'm saying that you can't establish that it is the Christian God based just on these arguments. You would need further argumentation. But he says here, the omni concepts are very late, and they grew out of the anthropomorphic concept of a God, man, or woman. El, Asherah, and Ugaritic text, the source for Hebrew scriptures. He says, read The Early Origins of God by Mark S. Smith and refute his sources. Yeah, I think this is a bunch of nonsense, to be quite frank with you. Look, if you're not a believer in God, you have to find a way to rationalize and justify like how these things develop. And I think this, I don't know anything about Mark S. Smith. He seems to me a purely secularistic kind of sociologist or religious studies scholar. He probably has no dog in the fight. And if he does, it's probably an anti-religious dog. The idea that he's trying to justify and rationalize these things. I'd be very cautious of that, honestly. I mean, just as secular people are very cautious with respect to, oh, those religious people, they're just going to believe whatever, their pastor tells them. They're just going to believe the gospels because they're just going to believe miracles. Like they're idiots. Guys, I think you should be just as skeptical. If you're religious and you have people saying, oh, I can explain away religion to you, be just as skeptical. Put it right back on them. There's no reason why these sociological, religious studies explanation should be given any credibility. I mean, take them for what they're worth, but know what they are. They are attempts to draw connections that are purely speculative. I mean, look, yeah, okay. Maybe there are a connection between El and Ashra. This gets into like the idea that, oh, the resurrection are just copy of a pagan myth. It turns out that's a really bad objection to the resurrection. It has nothing to do with pagan myths. And there is a question of like what came before, the cart or the horse. It seems like the earliest pagan myths that mimic the resurrection don't appear until about 150 AD. But again, that's an open question in the scholarship. You can see my video on this, one of my live streams on the resurrection in particular. But again, this is scholars who are extremely skeptical of the miracle stories. And so they go through this and they try to rationalize it away. But notice what they're doing, and I've said this in several comments with respect to these videos and all the things I've clipped. These people who are secular are coming into the religious scriptures, and they are not getting that evidence out of the scriptures. They're reading that into the scriptures. Like if I disbelieve miracle stories, I didn't get that evidence from the scriptures. Like if I say, oh, those gospels are just a bunch of nonsense miracle stories, only primitive people believe, and idiots today, obviously. That's not evidence from the actual text. That's a massive prejudice or bias that you go reading the text with. You bring that into reading the text. You don't get that evidence from the text. So be very cautious about that when you see like these just so explanations, like, oh, we know how the anthropomorphic God conception got developed, and it's this and this and this. I mean, be extremely skeptical, because that's what it warrants. It's just nonsense speculation is what it is. So in any case, that is, I think, guys, I know there's yeah. Hey, what's up, Andrew? Sunday. Yeah. All right. So I think we're kind of about at time. I've gone a little bit over what I intended to do, and I didn't get to all the comments, but I really appreciate you guys being here. Thanks for hanging this long. And I hope that you can recommend this to other people. Maybe I'll do like, actual like whiteboard work maybe someday and like get this into real video form. But thanks for being here regardless. So, all right. I appreciate you guys, and take care. Subscribe, like, share, please. And I hope to see you on the next one, because we'll go through the way 4 and 5 on the next one. And they are wildly different from ways 1 through 3. That's why I want to do 3 altogether. Wildly different, but easily identifiable, like as unique. And they're a lot 1 through 3. They're hard to individuate from each other, 1, 2, and 3, but they're easy to understand. As easy as it is to understand these things. They're a lot easier to understand. Ways 4 and 5, they're really hard to understand. So I hope that you will join me for that one a week from today, and I will see you then. So looking forward to it. Y'all have a good weekend, and Habemus Papam. We have a new Pope. God bless America. God bless the Vatican. And y'all take care. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.